Hi, this is Amber Rain Davis from NotableInk.com. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm excited to be sharing something a little bit different today. We're going to incorporate Zentangle into our Distress Oxide background. This card will be featuring Simon Says Stamps Spiritual Sentiments stamp set, which you can see here. Also, the Oh Happy Day stamp set, I'll be using that flower, and the large dot stencils from Simon Says Stamp. So I have an A2 sized piece of cardstock, white cardstock. It's Nina Classic Crest Solar White in the 80-pound version. And I have the large dot stencils taped down on top of that. I made sure that when I lined it up that none of the circles were cut off and that it looked equal throughout because I wanted to keep the whole car front. I'm using a sponge dauber to pick up the Mermaid Lagoon Distress Oxide ink, and I'm just twisting that down onto the circle. You can see now I've moved on to black soot, and you get really great coverage. It's really easy to get this on with the sponge dauber. Super simple, and it's a perfect size for these large dot stencil. It works out beautifully. Typically, when I first got the Distress Oxides, I wasn't in love with them. They blend really nicely, but I love super bright colors. And so the chalky surface bothered me a little bit. But in this particular application, the colors are still really bright. I'm not going to spray it with water so I can avoid that chalky look. What we're going to do next is start our Zentangle pattern. So I have the Hickory Smoke Distress ink marker here. I didn't have a black soot marker, and this worked just perfectly. So this is called, this particular pattern is called Cadent. And what you do is you do like an under-over pattern. You can see I'm starting at the bottom of one of the dots and then bringing it up in an S-shaped pattern to the top. So it's kind of a takeoff and landing on those circles. You pretty much get into a groove, and I generally do all in the same direction, as you can see I'm doing here, before I switch to the other direction. One of the things I recommend when you're doing Zentangle and it's going off the page, like these are here, get into your groove of what that pattern feels like. You'll start to get kind of a muscle memory doing the same pattern over and over. And then when you get to one of the dots where the end of your stroke is going to be off the paper, you'll see it right here. It feels very natural because you've gotten that stroke down. That's not a stroke I would start with. You want to start with your full strokes and get into a rhythm and a flow there, and then you can do the ones that are off the page. This is if you're just beginning. So I'm going to turn the page and continue those strokes. So this is, even though it looks very, very intricate, you can see that it's really just a two-stroke pattern. So you have the circle. So if I were doing this without a stencil, I would just draw a small circle or an orb in a grid pattern, and then I would go ahead and connect those dots with these S strokes. Now we're moving on to the next technique, which is called Aura, A-U-R-A, and what that means is to halo either the stroke previous or a shape or whatever area that you're trying to match the pattern. You're going to mimic it and draw a halo around it. So you can see I'm going inside of each one of those squares, if you will, and putting a halo around each one of those strokes. It's a very common technique that's used throughout Zentangle. I'm using a Sakura Pigma Micron 03 pen. I'll continue adding more detail inside of the halo that I just made, or the aura I just made. I'm going to put another orb inside of that and then halo around that C-shaped stroke. It's almost like a parentheses. So if you do 4 parentheses in each one of the corners, it's going to create an orb that's kind of squished into that space. And then when you aura around it, it adds some nice contrast and nice depth to that pattern. In addition to it adding that contrast, we're going to shade those areas later to give it even more depth. So I went ahead and completed that pattern throughout the entire card, and we're going to use Copic markers, the W1, W3, W5, and W7, in order to shade those insides of those squares. This is where you're going to get a lot of depth. You can also do this with a graphite pencil. Traditionally, when you do Zentangle, it's on a 3.5-inch square tile, and you shade with graphite, which is a beautiful look. You can get a lot of different contrast and shading with that. But since we're doing a card, I wanted to give the Copic markers a go. I don't use Copic markers very often, but I was in the groove with this particular card set of using them, so here we are. So I started off just shading two sides of the square, and then as I took a look at that, I decided that I wanted all four sides of the squares to be shaded to really add that depth. I started with my lightest color just to get an idea of where I wanted that shading, how far out to go, and then I started adding the darker colors. I'm going to go ahead and shade the orbs so that they look like orbs and they look more three-dimensional. And right about here, I'm feeling like there's just not enough contrast in those corners. So that's where I'm going to bring in, well, first I'm going to use the 0 marker to blend out some of that gray in the middle. And then I'm going to bring in a W7 to add more depth to those corners and get more contrast. So you can see that here. Now, once I had those pen and ink inside orbs shaded, the distress inked orbs looked very two-dimensional. So I'm using a General's white charcoal pencil in order to add some highlights to those orbs to give those also some dimension. So I'll just put all the charcoal on each one of them, and then I'll use either a paper stump or a tortillon, whichever one you have, to go ahead and soften out that charcoal. You could also use the tip of your finger as well. We'll keep going with a few more of those, and then we'll shade the inside border of those orbs. You can see I have 3 sentiments there. The Created to Create sentiment from the Spiritual Sentiment stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. That's really what inspired me to make this card. Is there was a lot of creation that went into this card design. So it was the sentiment that really sparked the card design here. So once the orbs are done, we're going to do a bit more Copic marker shading to both of the border edges. I went ahead and sped this up even further since you've already seen me do some shading. So this is the flower that you see in the finished card, and I actually created a different background prior to this card, and I didn't really like it. You can see it underneath my hand there. I created this flower when I was doing that background panel, and like I said earlier, sometimes the chalky finish of the Distress Oxides can bother me a little bit, so I wanted to add some sketchy glossy accents to add dimension and shine to the flower, and I went ahead and covered the center sentiment with this flower to add another round object on this card design. I hope you enjoyed this card today. I definitely enjoyed incorporating Zentangle into the card front project and the inspiration from just that very small little sentiment. If you'd like to see more cards with Zentangle incorporated into it, please leave me a comment below. And be sure to subscribe to my channel below and my blog at notableink.com so that you don't miss any of the future videos. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a great day.